Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first panel of the conference. It's the longest. It's going to be a 2-hour session with 4 fantastic contributions on the issue when we dive in on specific technical topics of climate metrics, physical, and transition risk. And the keynote speech set us up perfectly for that. When we are working on our technical topics in our institutions, it's often easy to lose forest for the trees when we are thinking at really narrow focus of how we integrate in sustainability or climate in various assessments, in various metrics. And it's the keynote speech that helps us to put broader perspective and why we're doing this and what is at stake for us. I was the part of the selection committee for the papers, and we had very difficult task of limiting the number of papers from excellent contribution. I'm hearing echo. And so for this panel, what we have done as a committee is to present technical papers on the topics of climate metrics from different perspectives. So we will have Stefano Battiston from University of Zurich, who will share insights on taxonomy and alignment.
Primarily Venice.
And Venice, of course. Who will share insights on taxonomy and alignment and transition risk at the country level, which is, I think, is a very important topic that it integrates both the firm level discussions as well as how they aggregated the national level, work with collaboration of Lucia Alessi from the European Commission and Joint Research Center at the Milano Bicocca. Then it will be followed by 2 colleagues from Banca of Italy, Riccardo Russo, with colleague Michele Loberto, that will introduce new methodology for assessing physical risks and implications for firms. And then we will have work of 2 doctorate students, José Luis Blasco from the University of Madrid and Elena Carrión Moneo from University of Burgos, who will present the work on strategic climate metrics, focusing on prioritizing key factors for decision making. Finally, we will have contribution from Bundesbank, as Julia Brown will be our discussant and will be providing insights, and hopefully we will have time to for Q&A. Without further ado, let me hand it over to the first presenter, Stefano. We'll have 20 minutes per presentation so that we can have some conversation afterwards.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here. For those who know my work, this is, which has been spanning different types, empirical, theoretical. This is a specific type of contribution that we have been making together with Lucia Alessi from the Joint Research Center of the Commission, the European Commission, essentially providing a methodology to and a very practical tool, in particular for aimed at the use for practitioners and central banks. So there is a working paper at the from the JRC working paper series. Accompanying that, there is a tool. Essentially, it's an Excel sheet where there's a correspondence between economic activities classified in NACE codes and 2 types of coefficients, which I will explain in a moment what they are. The acronym is TAC and TEC, stands for taxonomy, alignment coefficients, and transition risk exposure coefficients. And here you find the QR code for accessing the paper and the tool. So the outline of what I'm going to say. So the European taxonomy, as well as the transition risk, these are two, Rick was talking about transition risk, so that was a perfect introduction. I will say a few words about what the taxonomy is, but these are somehow two sides of the same problem, and they are key dimensions for the topic of this conference, in particular for embedding sustainability in risk, credit in particular, but also for market risk. So in order to embed sustainability in risk, you need to look at essentially how much economic activities may be aligned to sustainability objectives and how much they might be disaligned. And the taxonomy is only looking at the alignment part, if you want. And the transition risk is looking at the other side. So you need to have both. So what are the issues? Well, there is a lack of references. So if you ask the question, what level of alignment to the European taxonomy should we expect in a typical portfolio, market neutral portfolio, or, you know, in 1/n investment? Nobody knows. And so we wanted to, why? Because I mean, it's a moving ground. Firms are starting now those that are in the scope of the taxonomy, they're starting to disclose the level of alignment, but first of all, it's self-reporting. Second, many of the firms, the majority of the firms are out of that scope. So what is their level? You know, can we get some ideas about what is that? And similar for transition risk, because of course, transition risk is not something that firms are required to disclose about in quantitative terms. So for the moment, so the contribution that we make is to derive an estimation of both greenness in the sense of the taxonomy and transition risk in a sense that I will explain more in detail at a country sector level. And we are building on a previous work where everything was done just at the European level. And then we make an empirical illustration using the securities holding statistics of the European Central Bank. But just to be clear, there is no, this paper, the main contribution to the paper is developing the methods and providing the coefficients. The empirical work is just an illustration. So there's no econometrics, there's just some statistics that I will provide. Okay, so just a couple of words about the taxonomy. The European taxonomy for sustainable investments is a part of a broader roadmap, legal roadmap and normative framework that the European Commission has been developing in the last 5 years. So what is it in essence? It's a list of economic activities and performance criteria that contribute to some environmental objectives. What is not? It's not a list of companies. It's not a list. It's not a list of companies, and it's not it's not a ranking, it's not a rating, it's not an investment advice. So how when you think about taxonomy, you shouldn't think about firms in the first place. You should think about what are firms doing, and typically a firm is doing multiple things. Take General Electric is doing yes, electricity, but then turbines for, motors, engines for aircrafts, and then manufacturing of many other things. So, taxonomy then has to be applied to every single business line of the firm. There are 3 requirements. The economic activity has to make substantial contribution to at least one of the 6 environmental objectives that are listed over there, here. Then there are quantitative thresholds and metrics. Typically, in many cases, these are emissions intensity, but physical intensity. This is not financial intensity, so it's going to be typically grams of CO2 per kilometer for a car, or grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, okay, for electricity, for instance. And then the other criteria is the do no significant harm, the NHS. If I'm building a hydropower plant in a certain area, and in doing that, I'm destroying protected biodiversity or harming local indigenous people, that's not good, and that's not, and that violates the NHS criteria. So conversely, what is transition risk? The definition, and thank you for Rick again, for talking about this. The specific definition we're taking here, and the words are important, is that transition risk is the risk arising from agents, economic agents in general, not fully anticipating the impact of a delayed / disorderly transition to a low carbon economy. Of course, if they be fully anticipating, there wouldn't be any interesting risk to talk about, okay? So there has to be that partial anticipation or non-anticipation. So mind also that the risk doesn't arise from the transition per se. It's more from a number of potential mechanisms that can be at work, such as the lack of coordination and the inability of, or incompleteness of the insurance market, for instance, and or the inability of agents to anticipate what politicians will be doing, and things like that. There is a growing concern among supervisors about transition risk, in particular the Network for Green the Financial Sector has been a very prominent initiative among supervisors. Banca d'Italia is part of that, and let me mention that currently, together with colleagues, we are contributing to the generation of the new vintage of scenarios, the short-term scenarios, which will be issued later this year by the NGFS. In the past, some people have been using certain proxies of transition risk, like ESG scores. You could use the E component, but there are issues of opacity, and in particular, Monica Biglio, who is in the room, have been doing work on showing the disagreement of ESG scores. Plus, there are other issues of opacity, conflict of interest among the agencies that are issuing those scores. Greenhouse gas emissions are also being used as a proxy. Higher greenness would be lower emissions, and higher emissions would be higher transition risk in principle. However, there are limitations for that because, for instance, oil companies may have lower emission intensity in financial terms than, for instance, a utility company. But because most of the emissions are embedded are in the scope 3, okay? And so depending on how you count the emission intensity, and if you take scope 1, 2, 3 or not, so emissions don't tell the whole story. They have to be compared within sectors, not across sectors. Plus, it's a static picture, and there's a lot of other things that may happen. Another approach that has been used in the literature is, which I've been contributing to, is the climate policy relevant sector, which is a classification of economic activities based on different categories of transition risk. Now, so what we do, and of course, so in this presentation, I'm not aiming at, I don't have the time to get into the details, but I'm my aim is to give you the sense of what we are doing and inviting you basically draw your attention to this tool that I hope you will evaluate. So there are two types of coefficients that you find in the spreadsheet. One is called taxonomy alignment coefficients, TAC, and the other one is transition risk exposure coefficients, TAC. And so we built on a previous paper that was published on the International Review of Financial Analysis 2 years ago. And have been also, some results have been also published in the macroprudential bulletin of the European Central Bank, also 2 years ago. Let me try to give a sense of what we do. So first of all, we need to distinguish between two types of economic sectors. Those that we call ETS, European Emission Trading System sectors. So these are the sectors that fall under the regulation of the ETS. For those, there is a natural way of saying what is the level of alignment of a sector. Essentially, for ETS sectors, the taxonomy says that it is considered to be aligned an economic activity that is in the top 5% in terms of emission intensity performance. So those that are emitting less in the distribution in the top fifth percentile. And so why? That would require a bigger discussion, but essentially it's a dynamic. The idea of the policymaker there was to set kind of a dynamic target that, depending on the technology that is available in the economy, those that should be considered aligned to the taxonomy, those should be considered sustainable, or those who have the best technology in that moment. And that, of course, that would change in time. Some people, when I present this paper in another conference, say, "Oh, but then I cannot run my regressions because then it's a moving target and I cannot compare firms year to year." Well, you know, but the policymaker was objective was not to allow economists to run regressions. Was a policy objective. There is another category of sectors that are non-ETS, and there what we have been doing, and this was a lot of work, which personally, manually, we did, me and Lucia. So for every single economic activity, and there are 1,000 NACE codes, because we went through all of them. Eventually there's a few hundred that are for which you actually have to do which are relevant. You need to look at what is the taxonomy saying, what would be the criteria to be used. For instance, manufacturer of motor vehicles. There, it is aligned to it is considered aligned to the taxonomy in economic activities that for which the emissions, production of cars that are associated with less than 30 grams per kilometer in the lifetime of throughout the life cycle of the car. And basically that means that only electric cars pass that threshold. Let's not open up the Pandora box of the recyclability of batteries, materials, and so on. I'm not discussing that here. I'm open for that, and find it very interesting. But let's just take the taxonomy for given for a moment, and then let's see. We ask a different question: what is how do we estimate how much of that is aligned, and what is the level? So that was an example. Okay. So then the question is essentially boils down very simply in how much, if I'm investing €1 in a certain security, what is the fraction of that euro that in expectation end up in economic activities that are invested in electric cars? That's basically how we translate operatively the problem. I will call about TA and TE as taxonomy aligned holdings and taxonomy and transition exposure holdings. That's just the coefficient times the monetary value of the holdings in real terms or in nominal terms. Let me skip that or talk very briefly about that, but basically it's possible to, there is a little bit of formalization to explain what is the meaning of the coefficient, and it's what I explained briefly before. Essentially, the coefficient tells you what is the expected fraction of €1 that is ended up in a activity that is either aligned to the taxonomy or falls in these categories of activities that are exposed to transition risk. There is as I said, an Excel sheet for every country. So it's a matrix, countries and sectors. For instance, here you see back again to C29.1, that's the manufacturer of motor vehicles. There we looked one by one, and all the the data about sales of new of electric vehicles out of total vehicles, taking statistics. We did both Europe and a bunch of OECD countries. It was a lot of work because this is not on, well, for Europe, some of the statistics are in Eurostat, but not all. So it's a lot of manual work that you need to adjust. And then let me jump to the, basically the economic, the empirical illustration. Well, from a technical point of view, you just need to join two tables. Once you have the beauty of this, once you have the tool, if you have any information about the holdings of an investor and the NACE codes of the main NACE codes of the activity, or if you have firms you need to that are really doing multiple things, you can, and now data providers are going into the direction of providing the breakdown of revenues by NACE codes. Then you just do a join of tables, and you end up with what is the number that gives you the level of taxonomy alignment and transition risk. And last point, basically for each of these sectors, we went into the literature, and or either we're using available estimates or building back on the envelope calculations because nothing else is available. But in the sheet, for every sector, you find documented there the model has been used. And this is really, you know, it's been the first attempt of this tool. There will be reviews, and really comments are very welcome. So examples, and we hope that people will use it for now for empirical analysis and regressions and econometric studies. So what are the examples of things that you can look at? First, you can ask how much the holdings, taxonomy aligned or transition risk exposures, have been changing over the years. In absolute terms, we see that they've been increasing a little bit, but in relative to total, in fact, they've been also stable, decreasing a little bit, but then you can also break down by the holder sector, and then you can also look at relative to the holder sector. For instance, just to highlight an example here, the purple curve on the right-hand side over there, you see that's the OFI or other financial institutions. So they seem to have increased their exposure to transition risk over the years. So you could, a conjecture to be verified in other type of works, is it the case that transition risk has migrated to less regulated financial institutions? That's a possible conjecture that you may derive from this, which have to be verified. Then you can also look at the heterogeneity across sectors in different points in time, and we have done the study from 2014 to 2023 for each quarter. So to conclude, this is a tool that provides investors and supervisors with the ability of estimating at least a benchmark, an expected value of, you know, kind of a null model of what could be the alignment to the taxonomy and or the exposure to transition risk.
Thank you. And thank you for staying on time. And now we're going to dive into firm-specific issues on metrics, and I'll hand it over to Riccardo.
Yeah, thank you, Katia, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to present our work. I co-authored this work with Michele, who is also with us today, is sitting at the bottom of this room. And this work is named Climate Risks and Firms, and we developed a new methodology for assessing physical risks for firms. In particular, we evaluated the flood risk for companies in a region of Italy that was recently hit by a flood event last year in 2023, namely Romagna. And we did this leveraging on relatively new data set that allowed us to get to a higher level of detail with respect to previous work, similar works. The results that we are going to see today are preliminary. We are still working to extend them outside this region to the rest of Italy, and also to account for other sources of physical risks like landslides. My focus today is more on sharing some of the measurement challenges that we have faced in performing this analysis, and explain why it is important to correctly address the issues that we're going to see in the next slide, and also how we profited from this relatively new data set to maximize the accuracy of our results. When trying to assess the exposure to natural hazards for firms, the spatial accuracy of data plays a major role and raises a number of challenges. First of all, data on companies are not always accurate. For instance, the address may be known only approximately, and information on secondary sites may be missing. And even if, when this information are presented, there is usually lack of exact data on the distribution of firm activity across different sites. For instance, the number of employees or value added for branch. Also, lack of data on private investment in adaptation measure introduces another sort of uncertainty in this kind of evaluations. Environmental data are known to be inaccurate in many cases. For instance, hazard maps usually do not offer high accuracy and granularity, and usually are the results of the juxtaposition of different methodologies, and as such suffer high spatial inhomogeneities. And finally, in the case of extreme events, reports on the extent of the affected areas usually lack precise mapping information, and this of course translates in inaccurate evaluation of the damages. In this paper, we tackled two of these issues, namely the first and the last one of the list, and try to answer to this question: are measurement errors related to these aspects negligible, or are they significant? And before turning to the methodology, let's see how previous studies have addressed the issue of spatial accuracy in this kind of data. Regarding the distribution of firms' activity across different sites, we have found a number of works that relied on granular data. However, this data set were always limited either geographically to specific areas such as New York City, or to specific industrial sector. Whereas broader work usually lack detailed data on this distribution of firm activity. For instance, the recently published climate change related indicator of the ECB rely on accurate data only for a few countries, although effort is currently spent to close the data gap and get more accurate information. What we did was to leverage on the Italian business register dataset named Infocamere. This has a good level of granularity. Not only it contains the company legal address, but also the geographic location of all secondary units and the number of employees at municipal level. This last information will be crucial, as we will see in a while, to assign the relative importance of each branch to assign a comprehensive score to each company in our sample. Also, when we want to identify companies affected by extreme events, spatial accuracy, of course, plays a big role, and public data sets usually lack precise mapping information. We have here a number of examples. The Dartmouth Flood Observatory often provides only the centroid of the affected area in case of flood, although for the most recent event, some mapping information may be provided. The JRC Risk Data Hub and DM Data dataset assign flooded status to all administrative units, but do not allow to go deeper. We have found some works that relied on accurate dataset issued by regional authorities or that used proxy data hinting at the presence of excess water on the ground, like cumulative rainfall data. The point with all these datasets is that they do not allow to ascertain the flooded status at single sites level, at the firm level. So what we did was to use data coming from the Copernicus Emergency Management Service. We will come back in a while on what this exactly is. I just put here an example of the maps that we used, and you can see this was the area affected by the 2023 flood event. You can see the map representing the flooded inundated area is the blue shade. It is highly granular, and it allows us to distinguish flooded from not flooded productive sites, even when they are very close to each other. Let's now turn to the data that we used. So, as I said, we used the Italian business register data, Infocamere, from which we selected the manufacturing companies in Romagna. Romagna is the region that you see in the left plot. You can see how manufacturing companies distribute on this territory, headquarters in blue and local units in red. You can see this is a florid manufacturing district with about 4,000 companies and 80,000 employees. However, we also included in the sample companies operating at least one site in Romagna, but headquartered in other regions of Italy. You can see how this company distribute in the Italian territory in the right plot. And this anticipates one of our findings, namely the spillover that extreme events can have outside the area in which they hit. Of course, to evaluate exposure to flood, we needed flood hazard data, and we decided to use the flood risk maps provided by ISPRA, which is a national authority for environmental protection and research. And these maps divide Italy in three different, classify Italian territory in three different hazard classes, namely low, medium, and high. For instance, the high hazard class has an expected return time of flood event of less than 20 years. And you can see how Romagna is, the Romagna territory is divided among these classes. The southern part is not exposed to hazard because it's hilly, so flood hazard is limited to areas close to riverbeds, while the northern part of this region is exposed to significant hazard because it's flat and bounded on the north by the Po River. In fact, the 2023 flood event mostly hit the northern part of this map. We know that these maps are accurate in this area, and the 2023 flood event will give us the possibility, as we will see, to make a quick and very simple ex-post evaluation of these maps. Let's now turn to the methodology that we used to assign a score and to create an indicator for each company. The idea is very simple. In fact, we use the number of employees each branch hosts to weight the relative importance and create a unique company indicator. But we can just make an example, maybe it's easier. Let's consider company I with 200 employees. 100 employees work at the headquarters, H, and 100 employees work in a secondary branch, B. The headquarters are located in a safe area, while this branch is in an area which is prone to floods. Then we will have 50% of the employees exposed to flood hazard, and we can simply use this share to compute our indicator S for company I. And you can see in this histogram how this indicator distributes in Romagna. Tends to concentrate at 0 and 1 because many companies do not have secondary branches. However, you can see that 7% of the companies in our sample have partial exposure, so S values different than 0 and 1. And we found that this small share of companies is represented mostly by big companies, and this means that this 7% of companies accounts for 57%, so the majority of the workforce in our sample. To highlight the message, we compare our methodology to another one in which we assign all the employees to the headquarter location and divide the companies in our sample in three categories. Companies fully, partially, or not exposed to flood hazard. And you can see, of course, when we consider headquarters only, we will not have companies that are partially exposed to flood hazard. If you look at the last column of this table, you can see that not considering local units would lead to a 16% overestimate of the companies that we would consider safe, not exposed to flood hazard. And again, these 187 companies that would incorrectly be considered safe represent 30% of employees in our sample. So the message is that accounting for local units is very important, especially for large firms, and especially when we want to have a clear picture on the share of employees that are exposed to natural hazards. We also developed another indicator that takes into account the different nuances of flood hazard provided by the maps that we used. I will not go to the mathematical details of the computation of this indicator. I just mentioned that it ranges from 0, meaning no employees in danger, like the S indicator, to 3, meaning all employees exposed to high hazard. We see an example here of the results of this computation for Milan downtown, which is, of course, an area that is densely populated by companies' headquarters. And you can see we have green, yellow, orange, and red companies. What is interesting here is that Milan downtown itself is not an area exposed to flood hazard. So the hazard would be null. However, we have many companies that have not null values of this exposure indicator because they are exposing directly via local branches that are located in flood-prone areas. So not accounting for local branches would incorrectly assign a score E equal to 0 to all companies in this picture. We will come back on these aspects in a while. So now that we have exposed our indicators, we can go to the identification, we can switch to the identification of the flooded firms during the 2023 flood event. And we did this identification operation via this map that shows you the maximum water extent during the flood event in Romagna. We got this map from the Copernicus Emergency Management System, which is a near real-time system that can be activated by national authorities in case of extreme events, and joins data from satellite, from ground station, and in this case from hydrodynamic model to provide information that can be useful, for instance, in emergency response. In particular, this map comes from the risk and recovery mapping procedure of Copernicus Emergency Management Service and are characterized by a very high accuracy, more than 98% in detecting flood-affected locations, and 10-meter resolution. The high resolution and accuracy allow us to discriminate flooded from not flooded companies, even when their distance is small. And this way, we identified 1,200 companies directly hit by the flood and involving 18,000 employees. Interestingly, 99% of these companies are located in medium to high hazard areas, according to the ISPRA maps, and this signals a good sensitivity of the maps that we have used to build our indicators. Also, 10% of the companies hit by the flood have headquarters outside Romagna. You can see in the bottom right histogram how these companies indirectly hit by the flood event distribute among Italian provinces, with Bologna and Milan being the most affected ones. So this again to signals the significant spillover of the events outside of Romagna. The high level of details also allows us to estimate the exact share of flooded companies at municipality and province level. On the left histogram, you have the most affected municipalities, and in the right histogram, you have the share of flooded companies per province. And the importance of these results is that with respect to other reports of the flood extent, like EMDAT or JRC risk data, not only here are we able to identify administrative units that were touched by the flood, but we can also assign a severity score and make comparison among municipality or provinces that were directly hit by the event. And another useful information that we can extract from Copernicus maps and that let us evaluate the severity of the flood for each productive site is the maximum water level reached during the flood event. You can see the histogram of this variable for the companies that were touched by the flood. You can see that the median value was 60 centimeters. However, we have firms that for which the water level exceeded 2 meters. And this information can be used to assign, to evaluate the intensity of the event. This was the last result that I wanted to share with you. So to quickly wrap up what I think is the key message of these slides. First of all, we have seen how lack of data on secondary units leads to relevant inaccuracy in the estimation of the exposure of firms to flood hazard. We've also seen how reports on the extent of natural disaster like floods usually lack a level of detail that allows exact evaluation of the damages. And we have seen how leveraging on new data sets like Copernicus maps can mitigate this issue. Can economic evaluation be affected by these sources of measurement error? As a follow-up, we will match our data and Copernicus maps to consolidated 2023 balance sheets and try to evaluate the impact of the flood, and then repeat the experiment using more traditional reports on the event to see if this evaluation would change and how. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll switch to how we integrate metrics into enhanced decision making.
Also, on behalf of my co-author, Elena Carrión, that is here, and also thank you for the scientific committee for selecting this paper, because I think that we are unusual PhD students. As you can see, I am in my 50s, I studied doctorates, but the reason is because I was partner of KPMG during 15 years in charge of the assurance services in Europe and then internationally. And I was also involved in the technical expert group of the European Commission for defining the taxonomy, and I was the reporter of climate disclosures on the European Commission. And I learned a lot. I want to return some of these learnings now with this provocative paper that we are delivering about what happened if we are measuring wrong. And the idea behind this is that the secular lack of information that everybody is pointed out, we are always arguing that we have not enough data, the reliability of the data, the integrity of the data. Everybody is arguing about that. But I think that we have make many things for granted. And the first thing that we have taken for granted is what happened if the GHG protocol is not measuring right? Because at the end of the day, this protocol was defined 20 years ago, without any modification during these 20 years. And we need to revisit in the current circumstances. Because, believe me, do you think that makes sense to have 3 scopes? If all or most of the emissions are in the scope 3? And with this rationale, and taking into account that all the accountants of this world were working during the last 3 years in redefining the standards for the carbon accounting, using the same metric that we were using during the last 20 years, probably makes sense to have a look to what is behind the GHG protocol. Because the GHG protocol was not made to provide comparable measurements. Was not made for the things that we're using now. And this paper wants to invite people who is working on the carbon metrics and also how is they integrating into the credit risk assessment about what is really measuring GHG protocol. And is also could be a call to revisit some of the metrics that we are having for granted. The first thing is that the companies are, I am working for a company, for an structured company in I was at the assurance part, and now I am a reporter and an issuer. And the companies is arguing that all the architecture that they need in order to provide the information is very costly and is not so much efficient because nobody take care about this information. when you are providing this information, it's very, very, the value of this information for the issuers are not in the market, to be honest, as an issuer, and 6 billion issuer. And the cost for a company, according to the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission, is around $500,000, and according to the European EFRAG, is around 2.2 or 2.5 people in charge of that. Probably more people reporting than trying to transition to the low carbon economy. The second thing that this could be need to be revisited is that the comparability is not. It was not the purpose of GHG protocol. Let me review 5 topics that could be illustrating why comparison is not one of the strengths of the GHG protocol. The first is that, I don't know if you know, that the GHG protocol allows you to consolidate your emission by different approaches. You can use equity or you have a control. And if you are using control, you can use financial control or operational control. What does it mean? When you are providing your emissions, it's not symmetric with the financial control. Wow. All the intensity measures maybe not correct. The second important thing is that the GHG protocol, it gives you the flexibility to consider different GHG gases. You know that the Kyoto Protocol considers 6 different gases. Most of the companies are accounting the CO2, less the methane, more or less nitrogen oxide. But for all of them, very, very, very rare to have these emissions. Second problem that we can have are for the best and more assured data. Are we sure that we are using all comparable weapons that we have? Probably not. But they are not making nothing wrong. It's because the protocol allows you to do that. This is not because the companies are the devil. It's because the protocol and the assurance provider are signing this because the protocol allows you to do that. The third is that, I don't know if you know that the scope 2 can be measured by 2 different approaches, location-based or market-based. What does it mean? That if you are using the market-based, you are your electricity provider is giving you what is the emission of the electricity that you are consuming. But if you have not the invoice of your electricity company, you can use the electricity mix of the entire country. What does it mean? All the renewable energy that you are buying account 0. And this is not, let me repeat, because the companies are stupid or no, it's because the protocol allow you to do that, because at that time, 20 years ago, it was very difficult to collect this data. And the main purpose of the GHG protocol was, okay, guys, climate change is a problem. Have a conversation at your board level. And to do that, you need to have easy approaches and proxies. The third surprise is that for the scope 3, that this is accounting the most of the emission of a company, you can use econometric measurements. Okay, what does it mean? You take all your purchase and multiply by factors depending on the intensity of the country that you are buying. Not manageable. No, this is not manageable. But what happened? I have in my company 60,000 different suppliers. Could you imagine that I can collect all this information from the suppliers? Economic measure. And the fifth is because the emission factors. The protocol gives you a list of emission factors that you can use. And the differences of those emission factors are huge. You can use the US, the DEFRA, you can use the International Energy Agency. You can use a lot because the GHG protocol was a proxy in order to have this conversation in your company, not to compare and to make credit risk ratings. And the third elephant in the room is the cost, the problem of these inventories are not related to the countries that are produced. And the problem is that the transition risk is related to the jurisdiction that you are operating. If you have a cement plant in Denmark or Indonesia, you have a different risk transition, isn't it? You cannot know, you cannot identify where you are producing the emissions. And these emissions are not related to the NDCs of the country, and you cannot assess the transition risk. It's a chimera. When this frustrating and don't cry, we are saying, okay, where is the solution? How we can revisit all of this in a very simple manner. The first thing is that we are proposing that to go to basics. And to go to basics, we are using the same basics that at the beginning of the Kyoto Protocol, the people who were discussing how to develop the first climate agreement use, that this is the KAI identity, that are related to the activity of the companies and also how the intensity of the energy that they are using. If you have a look to a company and also to emulate the same approach that we are using for a country, you can discover that when you are using this for the different granularity approaches, you can translate the KAI identity to the corporate to the activity, the activity to the process. And in order to simplify this, you can say this. This is the real flow of the carbon. This is the reality. But we have a problem here, that this is the companies that as my colleague from the Oxford University say, that we need to quit. We need to don't emit, or we can change these activities that are based on fossil fuels, because it's triggering the rest of the economy. And the rest of the economy is divided by two companies. One part is the dependent that really needs CapEx in order to change. And we have the OpEx activities that they need to spend more in order to get the products from the low carbon or decarbonize. But the first part, the primary emitters, should disappear if you want to trigger and to change the economy as a whole. And this is a reality. If you focus on the real problems, probably you have more options. And we select on the dependent 3 sectors in order to show how to apply the KAI identity, in order to show where are the big animals or the emissions in those sectors. For this, we choose these 3 sectors, but probably is only limited, and we need to explore more in our doctorate studies on research. At the first, for example, on the automakers, only using the steel that they are using, and also what is the intensity of the vehicles that they are producing, only with these 2 factors, we collect all the emissions of the inventories, only with 2 measurements, only with 2. We introduce 2 more because the electricity will become the new normal for the automotive. But you need to take into account the battery has a backpack of carbon, and also depend on the energy that this electric car is using. But now, currently, with 2 factors, you can project the emissions with a correlation by 1. If you go to the cement, if you correlate only with the clinker production, only with the clinker production of a company, you can know what is the emissions with a correlation of 0.93. If you go to the steel companies, you only taking into account what is the intervention of the basic oxygen furnace in this process. Only with this, with one element, you can project all their emissions. Why we cannot focus on the problem instead to shape and shape and shape inventories that are costly and not giving us the information are distracting us. Focus on the topic. And these are our conclusions. Our conclusions are mostly focused on revisit the GHG protocol because it's a very, very relevant metric that every accounting body is using to provide the new standards. If you want to connect the next generation, that is to connect the carbon intensity also on the carbon or the climate change risk with the accounting, to connect this, you need to have better understanding on how this is connected with the economy. And the first is that to review most of the elements of the general elements of the GHG protocol in order to have more comparable metrics to avoid this flexibility or back doors, like how you are connecting the consolidation, the emission factors, and another aspects on the GHG protocol that should be revisited. The second is about the scope 3. If you consider that the scope 3 is the animal or the elephant in the room, please divide it in scope 1, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, or scope 4, 5, or 6, but provide more guidance to the companies in order to focus on the materiality of their emissions. The things that should be focused on the boards and also the managing agendas, because if not, they will be provided this confusion. They will still measuring the commuting emission of their workers instead to the furnace that they are using, and this is a waste of time. And the third conclusion that this is important is that in order to have the real exposure, you need to consider the breaking down these emissions for jurisdictions, because the jurisdictions are driven the transition risk. If people, companies with exactly the same emissions have different transition risks depending on where they are operating. But this is not in the current information that you are collecting. If you have not idea where they are, you have not idea about what the transition is. You have a mirror or something that seems same. Let us give you, Elena and I, some recommendations about how we see. We see that the first thing is that the GHG protocol must be revisited, but now we need to think if who could be the owner of this standard of metrics. Should be a private standard. Now is the owners of the GHG protocol is the World Research Institute and the WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Are very respectful institutions, but are the institution that you guys will deposit the confidence for the next generation of climate stress test. Think twice, and also about the governance. The second is that probably we need to revisit also about the materiality of the emissions, focusing on the real exposure of the companies, taking into account that this material part of their inventory is driven the transition. And the third is that probably we need, if we are thinking about the forward-looking information that we need in order to know what is the stress of our systems, we need to focus on those material emissions, taking into account how this the graphic that we put from the fossil fuels to the capex companies to the opex company, and how the risk is distributed across the sectors that are not the same. And we are considering the same way, taking into account the emissions. But it is not true. The truth is that the connection of those sectors is the real economy. And before we have that, or after we have that, we have a better transition plan. Only disclaimers that the limitations of our paper is now we have 4 or 5 sectors to study, but in all of these sectors occur the same. We have 2 or 3 bottoms to shift the companies. Thank you very much.
Elena, we'll hand it over to you to reflect on what we've heard and provide feedback.
Sorry.
Well, thank you very much, Katja, and thank you to the 3 presenters for these fantastic papers and these concise presentations, which make it easier for me to discuss the papers. So I think all of the 3 papers address really key issues when it comes to climate-related data. And my idea was to go through the 3 papers one by one and not giving exact summaries because we've just heard them and we're still fresh, it's the first session, but really to give you what for me were the highlights of these papers. And then some questions just came through my head as I was reading the papers. So I'll start with the first paper that was presented, skip the summary and come to the highlights. So this paper really has, for me, the highlight, of course, which is the contribution to address the key challenge of how to quantify greenness and transition risk exposure for financial portfolios when we do not have this information. When we do not have this information at the firm level for the firms underlying that portfolio. And their idea is to propose this country sector level coefficients that allow us to calculate these metrics. I think a key highlight and advantage of this paper is the transparency of the mechanics behind it, and also this open source tool that is provided for really anyone to be downloaded on the internet. And that makes really accessible and useful and practical also for practitioners, the findings of this paper. And this is evidenced, for instance, by the fact that a number of EU regulatory bodies have used or recommend to use this methodology. And it can be used in many ways. For instance, financial institutions can, of course, calculate the greenness or can estimate the greenness and transition risk exposure of their financial portfolios and can then use these assessments for setting up transition plans, doing stress testing exercises or scenario analysis. This can, of course, not only be done at the level of the portfolio of one financial institution, but also at more aggregate levels. And in this way, it is then also useful for supervisors, both micro and macro supervisors. Questions. I had a number of questions. I'll just address 2 here because we do not have much time. One refers to the transferability of your coefficients to other sectors or to other portfolios, because as you said, more and more data will become available in the EU, especially on large and capital market oriented companies. So I was thinking about SME loan portfolios, for instance, or portfolios with a different geographical focus, let's say emerging countries for which maybe you do not yet have country-specific coefficients. The second question I had was maybe also an obvious question. Your measure of greenness focuses on one specific criterion from the taxonomy, namely the climate change mitigation. So you explained that very well why you do it, but I was just wondering, how much do you think your results would change if you considered also the other criteria that are laid down in the taxonomy? With this, I would go to the next paper. I will first skip your paper and go to your paper, the last one. Go to the paper that was presented last, and because it also talks about transition risk, not at the portfolio level, but at the level of individual companies. And for me, really, one highlight was how the authors effectively and very clearly describe the limitations of the greenhouse gas protocol, and also illustrate this description by answers that were given by companies in their questionnaires to the CDP. I think that made it really very clear and striking answers, actually, I would say. Of course, here also the contribution is your new approach that you've proposed to account for greenhouse gas emissions at the company level based on the Kaya identity by focusing on really key drivers in the corporation's value chain. And I think with this approach, you can help companies to identify the primary sources of their CO2 emissions and help them improve their CO2 efficiency. You also have an application of this approach in your paper. And the application shows that for these 3 sectors that you apply your approach to, it seems that the approach is very able to find these material factors. And in this way, the methodology offers a cost-efficient solution for climate data collection. And in this way, your paper also addresses another key issue, which is the high cost for granular data. I was really shocked by the numbers that you presented in your paper. I was not aware that it was €500 million. So I found that shocking. And I think there's also another contribution of your paper on another level that you have not addressed now in the presentation, but there's this disconnect of calculating emissions on a product level, on a company level, on a national level. And your paper could help to overcome this disconnect between the company and national level because you both use this Kaya identity. Questions that came to my mind were maybe in your paper you could a bit elaborate on how your approach compares to other methodologies that are proposed in academic literature, or also tools that are available for practitioners already that do similar things, and that would just help to highlight potential limitations or especially the advantages of your approach even more. And I was also thinking of who would be the intended users of your approach. So which type of companies did you have in mind, especially with respect to the sector of the company or to the size of the company? Because the three examples that you gave were companies that are already very aware of their greenhouse gases and that answer to the CDP questionnaire. So they're comparatively advanced in this field, I would say. But there are many other sectors and companies that for which maybe the approach would be more interesting or useful because they do not have this information yet. And what do you think about that? And I was also then wondering how, for these 3 sectors, I don't know whether it was easy, but it was possible to derive 1 or 2 really material factors that drive greenhouse gas emissions. Do you think that will be the case for other sectors as well, or are there maybe some sectors where they're really different driving forces? Oh, sorry, I did. And with this, I would come to the 3rd paper, which talks about physical risk. So your paper, and so I'll skip the summary and go to the highlights. So really the highlight of the paper is, of course, a novel approach that is proposed to address this big problem that we have when we talk about physical risks, namely the lack of precise establishment information beyond the information of the headquarter. And you do this by combining unique, probably local data sets, and by this you're able to provide us with more accurate hazard exposure metrics, both at regional and firm level. I found it very interesting how transparently you were discussing all the limitations of your approach, which of course exist, but are evident always when you talk about physical risk exposure. And I think that you very well show the practical relevance of your methodology by applying it to this regional sample of Italian manufacturing firms. And by this, you show that really when you take into account these various establishments, that significantly changes the level of exposure of the affected firms. And you also show that even natural disasters that are so localized like this flood do have impacts beyond the area that is immediately affected by this disaster. And I think, of course, beyond the benefits of this newly proposed methodology, leveraging on this unique data set that you have, the relevance of the paper goes beyond it because you provide in your paper such a good and comprehensive methodological guidance on how to address this issue of exposure of physical risks, and that really I find encouraging for other researchers also to go into this direction. A few questions that came to my mind. So of obvious questions like, would your methodology be able to be adapted to other sectors, other regions, other sectors, other regions, other natural hazards? Would modifications be necessary? If yes, which ones? And I was wondering, you don't talk about the time dimension of your metrics that you propose. Are they rather backward or forward looking? Maybe you could comment on that as well. And who do you envision as the primary users of your metrics that you propose? Here I was wondering, especially, are there maybe restrictions to data sharing of the data that you use? Can they be shared? And this will probably define how useful they can be for different users. And of course, what are the next steps for your methodology? Do you plan to expand it to all Italian companies and create a national data set? You said you're planning that. I think if I was working at the Italian ECAS, that would be something I would be hoping for. So thank you very much again. And I just have this last slide, which is this nice pyramid that I copied from the NGFS final report on bridging data gaps. And each of the triangles shows one of the key challenges for climate-related data. And I have then just added where I think that the three papers provide really a benefit with these colorful pluses here. So I will leave you with that, and thank you again for the great papers. Thank you.
As Julia asked questions to all of the contributors, I would like to give a floor to respond in the order in which Julia directed them. Stefano, would you like to start?
So thank you, Julia, for the very kind comments and for the very relevant questions. So well, first of all, let me start with a just preamble. So these, with this contribution to the methodology to assess the alignment to the taxonomy and the level of exposure to transition risk of a portfolio, there's no claim that we are solving the sustainability problems of the world. We are, let me remind you, because this is really something I'm thinking on various dimensions. We are on a trajectory in terms of emissions. We're growing emissions overall globally. Biodiversity loss is increasing. Pollution is increasing. So when we do this, when we apply these methods, we are not even changing the direction of these trains. We're acting on the derivative of that. So hopefully we are going to be decreasing a little bit the growth rate of the damage. Okay, just to understand where we are. Now, having said that, two questions: transferability and SMEs. So in fact, the method is specifically meant for SMEs because for listed companies, typically you can get the numbers nowadays from 2023 annual reports in Europe. All large companies, and essentially about 5,000 of them, they are under the scope of the taxonomy. So they provide 6 numbers: share of revenues that are aligned, shares of CapEx, shares of OpEx that are aligned. And so you can get the number if you trust the number from the company itself. Then, of course, these numbers are going to be more and more audited by third parties. So, and depending on the sectors, in some cases, it's not so easy to cheat the number. Okay, then maybe not very interesting for the company to try to cheat. Now, the problem is for SMEs that don't have to report these numbers. And so the method has precisely been developed to try to say, okay, if it is, a company that is, a utility company in the waste processing in a certain municipality, what is the average rate of alignment that you expect if you're putting the money in a bond issued by this company based on the typical rate of recycling, or the criteria that are specific for that economic activity in the European taxonomy. That's the idea. So you can, and then for a utility that generates electricity for which you don't have information, if you have the information, you use the information. You don't have the information, the best you can do is use the information about that country. And in some cases, at least it's a base. Now, we covered Europe, then a number of OECD's countries, and how much is that transferable to emerging countries? It is transferable. It's just a matter of manual work on picking up what kind of data is available and coming up with a reasonable back of the envelope or simple models, and at least you have a kind of a bottom solid level. So I hope that more researchers will be interested in following up on this, but it takes a lot of manual work. So just to and it's not manual work, but it's also you have to kind of use your intelligence to navigate through the different types of data that are available and try to use the one that makes more sense. About mitigation versus other objectives. Yes, it's true. This is essentially focusing on the mitigation of climate mitigation objective. There are other 6, and I think the climate mitigation objective is the one that unfortunately is the easiest one, because the way in which the taxonomy has been devised was in the beginning was to start with science and designing criteria that would allow you to tell at the atomic level of individual activities whether they are aligned or not. Things start to, I would say, being less clear at some point. We know there's been a big debate about what happened at the very end of the, before the publication, actually with the amendment to the taxonomy, with the introduction of gas and nuclear, because that broke the symmetry that was, previously was basically you could do the assessment activity by activity, plant by plant. And since then, for those 2 activities, basically the alignment depends on what the company will do condition to other things in the next until 2030 and what is the policy of the government. So it's a whole endogeneity problem that breaks completely the symmetry of what can be done. Now, unfortunately, for other dimensions of the taxonomy, which I didn't have time to look into specifically, but I foresee similar issues where you cannot simply send an engineer and verify a number and then you tell whether that economic activities on site is aligned or not in terms of adaptation versus water biodiversity, and not to mention even the social and governance dimensions. This, unfortunately, I'm afraid that this will become more complicated. But I hope I can tell you more positive news once we look into that analytically.
José Luis, would you like to?
Thank you, Julia. You are very kind with us. Also, your comments and very interesting questions. Three remarks or answers to your question. The first is that the companies, we move with a very simple rule: risk reward. In order to have better information, we need to provide a clear equation of risk reward for the companies, and sometimes the companies are not seeing the benefits to invest more, to have better information to provide to the market. The question that we are trying to put into or to take to the debate is that we are having a very strange sensation from the people who is working or who was working during the last 20 years, that at the end of the day we are reinventing the wheel, and at the final of the game we are getting the same crap that we had 10 years ago. And this is frustrating because sometimes we see all these great institutions like the IFRS or EFRAG working during years to reinvent the GRI that we had 2 years ago with another format, but with their logo. Our invitation is that don't take nothing for granted, because the things has changed. And the things that we had done 20 years ago probably should be revisited. And there are two things that are important to revisit that we have no time. We are in an urgency and we need to go to the material things. And the material things give us a very clear picture about what is the fossil fuel industry that should change as soon as possible. What is the demand of the new green capex in the middle of the economic activities, that this is the shipping industry, the steel, the cement, that they need to transform, and they need capex in order to transform their activities, because if not, we cannot produce steel, cement. And the third, that this is another part of the demand, that this is trigger the OPEX. They need to see what is the value proposition of to decarbonize their supplies, and what is the price of carbon on another instrument that give them some instruments to improve. But there are different types of impacts. They need different type of policies, and also it reflects this into the risk, and then the risk policies could be very irrelevant. And the third is try to don't shoot to GHG protocol as the GHG protocol. Believe me, I am very, very proud about the role of the GHG protocol during the last 20 years. But now the situation has changed. And when the situation changed, they need also to change. It is not a critic of the GHG protocol. I think that if the context has changed, probably we will need also to rethink how we are measuring that, in order to avoid the credibility dilemma, that this is undermining all the climate policies, and that this is, oh, the data is wrong. Okay, guys, because it's the companies are pirates. No, it's because sometimes we need to also to think wider and see what is the context of the companies are reporting, and try to take this into account in order to simplify and give them the opportunity to have this risk-reward equation that I mentioned also present.
Yes, so many of your questions touched the point of the possible extension of our work. So I will go through this. Regarding the extension, what concern considering other sources of physical risks, we are almost ready with the same indicators that we have seen for landslide risk. And this was straightforward because landslide hazard maps are provided by ISPRA. And so it was very easy to replicate the work. Our main limitation is that here it was that we are only two working on this topic. We also have our duties. So we had, the workforce was not enough. Regarding other sources of physical errors, we still need to evaluate which environmental data source we can use. And this, I jump to the point of forward-looking indicators, so to take into account of the climate change scenarios. I think that regarding this point, we cannot work by ourselves, but we need to cooperate with scientists, and that's why we started a collaboration with the National Institute for Hydraulic Protection, and we are, in order to get useful information and also specific maps that can indicate the possible scenarios and also other sources of physical risk. Regarding the extension outside Romagna of this work, our main limitation here was that we could not carry out this analysis with OpenStreetMap, because OpenStreetMap does not always provide you the necessary level of detail. And we needed to recur to outside providers of geolocation services. And this raised a bureaucracy issue that we are currently addressing, but we have a limitation in the number of addresses that we could get. So that's why this proof of concept started from Romagna. Regarding the possibility to circulate this indicator, I would say at the administrative unit level, So aggregated level, of course, the single indicators for single companies, let's remember that we are processing the address of the company, so this raises a question about the privacy issue. So probably we will have to first perform an assessment and then see if how much these indicators can be circulated. I think I touched all the points.
We have now enough time for questions, but before we do, maybe a very quick reaction from me, from the IMF perspective, especially from the perspective with regards to emerging markets, since most of the focus has been on OECD and European countries. The way we selected the papers for the panel was to demonstrate this friction between the demand for quality and high granularity data and the complexity that it brings in integrating into decision making in investment processes. And this is against the urgency of the matter, and within a very difficult global landscape with high interest rates and geopolitical tension. Unfortunately, what we see from the IMF perspectives when we are talking to the financial industry on channeling the capital for climate action in emerging markets, access to data and quality data becomes almost a scapegoat of not going into difficult markets because they're costly, because they're difficult, and it takes time. And we've seen two types of financial institutions that those use requirements for data as an excuse of divest or not go into those markets, versus those that say, well, we know the basics. We know that what needs to be done, and we will be preemptive and making the decision in the absence of the granularity data that we need. So this is certainly was the objective for the session, and thank you for all of the contributors to actually delivering on that objective. So now we have time, 20 minutes for Q&A, directly to all of the contributors of the panel, but also since we didn't have time for Q&A in the first part of the session, maybe if there are any reflections, welcome that too. And please introduce yourselves when you ask a question.
I'm Alessandro Mistretta from Bank of Italy. I have a question for the first paper, for the last one. About the first paper, more related to the empirical part of the paper, you showed that energy sector is more aligned with respect to other sectors. I want to ask if, in some sense, this could be related to the quality of data, because energy sector belongs to ETS sector, also is a sector in which we have few big players, and probably the quality of data that we can collect from this sector is higher with respect to other sectors with a lot of small firms. Related to this fact, another result that you show is that government sector, in some sense, is more aligned with respect to other one, and you argue that basically this is related to the fact that governments hold a lot of share in energy sector, right? Probably you can support this argument with the cross-country correlation between different countries and the importance of investment of the government in energy sector. About the last paper, for sure, this is an improvement in the sense that you propose a very simple, if you want, procedure in order to impute emission. However, from my point of view, there is an effort that you ask to the analyst, because you have to well know the production procedure that different industries adopt, and when you have to, when you study, when you have a lot of industries, you have to study the different process and then derive the most important driver, emission driver, and then you have to in some sense impute the emission according to this driver. And I want to ask if could exist a more simpler or generalized version of your rule that in some sense avoid this kind of study. And another question is related to your example on automotive sector. You have an R squared equal to 1. That is like very high, if you want. Probably these results depends on the fact that total emission that you use actually is already based on your proxy, because an R squared is equal to 1 is very, very high. Thank you.
We can pick up a couple of other questions before responding.
Fabio Lucia, I'm at the IMF. Sure. Okay. So going back maybe the point that Katia made, in some sense, a multidimensionality trade-off here. And I'm not sure if it's between a question or a statement, which I appreciate your reaction. You can think of like a number of trade-offs here, right? One is the granularity of data. So ideally, you want high quality, comparable, consistent data that can be easily aggregated and so on. There's an efficiency side and cost of this, right? We have seen the cost of collection just from the SEC side, for example. That's the main complaint that you hear from US firms. Then you have the one of geographical representation, right? You have advanced economies, most of this was about AEs, but there's very little in terms of emerging markets. And so when you think about these trade-offs here, you can think in terms of like 3 buckets. Like one is the data. Again, you want high quality, you want comparable. There was a proposal to have a public utility. There is a concept out there that is already this, which is the net zero data public utility that GFENS has sent out. It's very small number of firms, and now they are facing issues related to corporate data, proprietary data, how to do it, how to make it public. So it's very complicated to get there. And that's only on emissions and more than that. The second piece is the taxonomy / classifications. There are more than 200 out there between public and private. And they range in between, if you take taxonomies of classification in the world, both public and private side, it's more than 200. And so you go from the more detailed European Union one to the lack of any in the US government, for example. I think the idea that everyone in the world will convert to the EU, I think it's, personally don't think it's going to happen. So I think you need to think about interoperability, how to make it efficient to actually operate across different taxonomies. And then there is the disclosure, right? We have the ISSB that is trying to do this, but they're facing a number of issues. They went very fast, and now that they need to implement, you start facing the reality of how complex it is, right? So just on transition plans, you have different assumptions about scenarios behind that, so it's not clear what you compare across different countries. So the question is like, there seems to be in my mind 2 risks. One is fragmentation. You have the advanced economies going one way and the emerging markets left behind, and the cost of capital for this country will rise in terms of private capital, at least in the short term, instead of helping them, will actually would hurt capital flows going to emerging market. And the second one is, how do you aggregate all this for decision useful financial sector? Like when you talk to the private sector, the first thing they tell you is that they are inundated by data. They just don't know how to aggregate all this to actually get to some simple pricing. So how do you put all this together in something that actually is decision useful for financial markets?
2 more questions, maybe?
Simone Narizzano, Bank of Italy. I have a simple question for Riccardo. If you have any idea about the uncertainty surrounding your estimation of exposure to flooding risk, could elaborate a little bit on that.
Good morning. Thanks to all the presenters for the very interesting presentation. So I have just a very general question, in the sense that there are many problems with climate metrics that, as we said, varies from lack of standardization, data quality, accuracy, regulatory fragmentation. So we have really lot of climate metrics, lots of reports. As a final user, we don't know which data do we have to use. also for doing policy analysis. So in this context, I was wondering whether artificial intelligence can help. So I know that right there, out there, there are a few projects. I don't want, to advertise some of them, that they are really trying to facilitate the analysis by building climate-related risk and metrics that use different reports. And so I was wondering whether artificial intelligence can help us in the future.
So should we just take this round first or collect all the questions? We have quite a few to all of the participants. How many more questions do we have? Enough for another round. So let's start with this and then we'll, so maybe quick reactions so that we can allow for more questions.
Yeah. Okay. So energy sector and government. So the data I showed are not about the energy sector per se, but is the holder. So it was a bit quick, but we can discuss that later. But basically, what we looked at is how much the portfolio, the current portfolio of various European holders, institutional sectors, banks, investment funds, governments, and others, what is their level of alignment? Okay, then it's true that because governments, or I'd say it's simply what's in the statistics at the moment, governments tend to have big shares in the utility sectors, not the energy in general, but maybe also in the oil and so on. But let's say because the utility sector at the moment in Europe, 30% of essentially their activities turns out to be aligned to the taxonomy, then it's one of the biggest chunks, basically, where you find a big part of that's just the result of how the taxonomy is designed and what is the structure of holdings. Okay, I didn't make other statements there. So we are not yet at the an explanatory analysis. Then trade-off. The question from IMF. It was a very deep question. So my reaction is I have two reactions. On the one hand, I would say the world has changed. We are now in a phase in which we realize that there is climate change, and there is also the finite nature of resources is now in the horizon of our decision making, basically. And so for individual firms, collecting data about what they're doing, where they're doing, and what kind of exposure to risk they have, in my view, is just a new way of doing business. And firms have to get equipped with that. If they don't, they're out of business. That's one reaction that I have when I talk to practitioners. From the point of view of supervisors, I think what you're pointing out to is there's a big public good problem. Because in order to supervisors to make a risk assessment at a macro level, we need not just the data of an individual firm, but we need to be able to aggregate up. And that requires not just granularity, comparability issues, interoperability of taxonomies, and so on. Now, the European taxonomy was an attempt of one jurisdiction of trying to solve that public good problem by providing a dictionary. I'm not defending the European taxonomy, but I'm just saying what it was. It was an attempt to provide one dictionary, science-based, of what can be defined as sustainable. Then, of course, if everybody comes up with an alternative competing taxonomy, then we are even losing that particular advantage that there was. And so the risk of fragmentation is there, and then the taxonomy came with the idea of resolving the mess of the ESG mess in terms of disagreement. And now we are going back in, the risk is to end up in a mess of multiple alternative taxonomies where then we have at the same level of opaqueness or incomparability. So I agree with you, there is that danger. So we would need a international authority or organization that at least recommends that builds an international dictionary. By the way, there would be some hope, because if you think about economic activities, we have an international and completely, uncontroversial way of classifying economic activities. That is basically the one that is used in the national accounts. It's called the ISIC, and there is one international family, and every single country is taking a small variation of that, but they're all their interoperability that you're talking about. So if I go to Italy, there is a code, and with that code, I can go back into the original code in the ISIC. And so all these codes from different countries, they can talk to each other. And we need something like that, not just for economic activities as such, but for economic activity in relation to sustainability. That's what we would need. We need an international authority that does it.
Who else? Any response? Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. Let me go to the basics. We have a threshold, we have a trajectory, a pathway, and we have a transition plans. In these transition plans are in the NDCs. The only transition risk that we have as a company comes from the national determined contribution. No more. No more. If we focus on the part of the pie that are really contributing to the decarbonization of the NDCs, why we need to put all this mess around the companies? Focus on the topics that are really need to be decarbonized. Our suggestion is that in order to fulfill with the requirements of the credit exposure is to focus on those that really will be threatened by the NDCs. Because if not, you are procrastinating about if this is real or not real, the risk at the company level. And this is the conversation that you have, guys, into your boards. Is the climate risk real? Yes, it's real, because in my country, we need to cut our emissions by half in only 6 years. This is a real risk. Focus on the topics that are really matters. Why? Because everybody wants to be involved into the decarbonization, because we are seeing what is the opportunity. But don't be confused. We need we are in an urgency, and we have a dozen of sectors that should be decarbonized as soon as possible. Focus on that. Focus on that. And if we are trying to embed into the risk assessment, we need to focus on the sectors that are really forced to decarbonize in the 6 years. And the other things, if you want to become net zero by heart, that's fine. But this is another topic. This is not a question of voluntary, that this is fine. It's a question of systemic risk in the financial systems. The second thing that is around the taxonomies. We are misinterpreting sorry for this, for the taxonomy. Taxonomy is activity agnostic. Should be the real philosophy of the taxonomy is this activity compatible with the net zero in 2050? Yes or not? And this is very clear. When we were defining the taxonomy, it was the philosophy. We are all in an elevator, a time machine, push the 2050, and we open the door and ask to the first person, are we net zero? Yes. How the electricity is produced? With less of 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. How you are producing the energy, this is not the problem. It is not in the taxonomy, it's about the threshold. If we keep the philosophy, that is difficult, of course, because the national authorities are trying to put their industries into the taxonomy. But if we follow the philosophy that this activity compatible with the net zero, yes or not? If it's yes, we want to channel funds to this activity. If not, please don't impulse these activities in your economy. It's very simple. And I think that according to the current statistics, most, except the Chinese is very similar to for example, for the European. If you go to South America, that they are very keen on the taxonomies, the Chilean, the Colombian, or the Mexicans are copy and paste from the European. I think that Europeans has made a very good job on this, and the influence of the European taxonomy is influencing. But probably as we found, I think that we spent 100 years to consolidate the accountancy rules. Maybe we have 100.
We don't, but
reply to Simone, there were several sources of uncertainties, and we addressed this aspect in several points in the paper. I did not go through the details in my talk today because I didn't have time. Just to mention, for instance, the spatial accuracy that comes with the geocoding service that we used. We made some Monte Carlo exercises to evaluate the impact of the source of uncertainty. We have seen this is small, so I didn't show it to you today because the effect would have been small in the results that we have seen. And then, interestingly, this uncertainty shifts the risk estimate to the upper bound. So what we have seen today is the best case scenario, let's say. And just to add something, what Valentina said, we also had the impression in shortlisting the data set that we wanted to use in our analysis that there is too much data, because you have Copernicus, you have JFC, you have many other sources of data that can be used. Our strategy up to now has been to identify a single data set that best fitted our purpose, but I also think that using AI or generative AI in the future might be a good road to get better results.
Maybe before we go in for the second round, I'll use the role of the chair to challenge a little bit of my European colleagues on the narrative that the climate change is a consensus. This comes from being based outside of Europe, but also working with the emerging market countries. It is a very European-centric view, and World Bank has been doing a survey of emerging market countries for their priorities, policy priorities. Climate change comes 12 out of 16. So is the US 12 out of 16. So there is also the issue of climate justice that does get on the way of how they see what they should be doing in terms of their climate policy. So emerging market world is the fragmentation, and their response to climate change is different than is what is in Europe, but it's also challenging because very soon emerging markets will be 3/4 of emitters going forward. They continue to grow, and that generates more consumption of energy. With that, let me open another round for very, very quick reactions.
Hey, Fabrizio Ferriani, Banca d'Italia, and I will follow your suggestion also for quick questions to the previous session and to Professor van der Ploeg. You mentioned several times tipping points, and your reference were clearly to temperature, but I would like to also ask you your assessment about different type of tipping points. Some were mentioned now, in particular about fragmentation in policies, fragmentation also in the commodity markets that are used to let's say, enhance the transitions, lack of international commitments across countries, how this in a way could impact the path towards the transition.
Yeah, so Sante Carbone, Stockholm University. I had just two quick questions, one for Riccardo. In the idea of replicating your approach of estimating the partial exposure of firms to flood risk, have you checked whether this measure of using the employee counts correlates with where the assets are located? Because I'm thinking all of these firms are clearly manufacturing firms, but it might be important to rule out that you're capturing one location where it's only administrative activity, but rather the impact of the physical risk on the actual physical capital that is located in one of the points. And then I also wanted to ask a question to Rick on the previous one. There is this literature about the effect of financial constraints once you start considering heterogeneous firms and how their decision of which kind of capital, clean or dirty capital, to employ in production is conditional on the liquidity that they have available. So I was interested in your view whether it is still safe to neglect this part and assume this representative firm sector, or whether in order to get correct trajectory of emissions that come from the technology mix that firms are using, we should also look into this dimension. Many thanks.
Maybe not a question, but the reflection from the bird's eye view of the paper. So one gets the sense that data maybe are too much. There are too much data available for policymakers. If you look at the perspective that Rick van der Ploeg was mentioned in the beginning, that is the view of the policymakers of the world, the leaders of the world who need to know what to do. They have plenty of data to act upon, but they don't, basically. On the other side, from a financial operator viewpoint, you may have the opposite problem. In spite of the wealth of data, you still you dig deeper, and you still find a layer that you haven't been able to control. The paper by Riccardo shows you that no matter how deep you go into NESI codes, for instance, you still have the differences that are not captured in the available data. So as a financial operator, you may be caught between the need to go deeper and deeper, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, you're left wondering about transition risks, which are largely in the hands of governors or of governments who do not seem to be willing to act. So again, it's just a reflection, but views would be welcome. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Roberta Fiori from Banca. I have also two quick questions, one for José Luis and one for Stefano. For José Luis, the GACA protocol has become a point of reference in many policy works at both international and European level. I have in mind the sustainability reporting works made by the SSB and the FS9, but also electric disclosure. So my question is whether in your analysis you have taken into consideration, my feeling is that stakeholders have made a lot of efforts and investments to collect this data. So my question for you is that whether in your analysis you have taken into consideration the extra costs that stakeholders would put to go to the basics, and whether the net benefits at the end would be still positive or none. This is the question for Stefano. You were very clear on what to do and what is not. You also said that the tool is mainly addressed to SMEs to help them to drive their assessment. So my question for you is that based on the level of accuracy of the tool and the level of granularity, do you think that the tool could also help driving the assessment for risk management and supervision purposes?
So my question is, I'm Carolina from the University of Oxford, and my question is about emerging markets. What should they do to attract capital, considering that the data quality issues there are the highest, but at the same time they have the highest cost of capital and the highest investment needs? And you mentioned that so institutions use it as a scapegoat, the data quality. So it seems that this is not the only problem. Like, this is not the issue that is really preventing them. And we also were presented today with like the actual cost of doing the emissions calculations, right? And these seem prohibitive for many companies in the emerging markets. So what should they do?
Thanks. My name is Joanne Mars, and I'm with the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. So I thought your presentations were excellent. I have a question for Jose. And I think it's really relevant, the work you're doing. It's super interesting because, as you may know, the Basel Committee consulted on a Pillar 3 disclosure for climate-related financial risks earlier this year that include a proposal for Scope 3 emissions. And certainly we get a lot of pushback from the industry about the lack of data methodology, and scope 3, I think, is going to be an important consideration for us as we try and finalize this year. Just from a practical perspective, I guess that's how I kind of think about things is, you know, I guess my question is, should we let perfection be the enemy of the good? I mean, I guess what would be the right time to think about reopening the GHG protocol when jurisdictions, many of whom are in process of adopting ISSB standards, should we let that go ahead? And, or I'm just curious about the timing to, I guess, start with something. Is it better to kind of get some data, some disclosure, so that the market has this information and then sort of fine tune it? Just worried, I'm just concerned about slowing things down. So I appreciate your perspective and a really great presentation. Thanks.
Very quick reaction on emerging markets. We'll hold on to the question until the concluding panel for the conference, and we'll take on those questions there. So that specifically will be addressed in the panel. But very quick reactions from the panelists and any concluding thoughts so that we can close. We're running over time, but it's been a very interesting conversation.
Okay, super fast. Shall I start?
My apologies, of course. And we probably should start with the keynote speaker to respond to questions first.
Okay,
thank you.
Okay, I will quickly respond, but I also have a question for Stefano. So I'm a bit worried what we mean by transition risk. So when I looked at your definition on your slide, you said something like is not properly taken account of that it might change. So that so that leads me to, whereas in my analysis, I look at that as well, but I tend to look at anticipated transition risk. So I know that there's a probability that the government might shift. So in that case, stuff is priced into the markets. Whereas if you have unanticipated transition risk, it's not priced into the markets. I think that distinction between unanticipated transition risk and anticipated transition risk is very important, because there's evidence, empirical evidence, so the work of Patrick and Massin and others, that the stuff is priced in, that therefore firms are more forward-looking than we think. So I wonder whether stress test on the whole that they use unanticipated transition risk, or what I would call, for lack of a better word, anticipated transition risk. Then to a quick response to the two questions. There was one question about tipping points and how they may react. So for example, in science, definitely the case. So there's a whole literature which I've contributed to as well called cascading, or domino effects, tipping the dominoes. So you typically see if there's one climate disaster may lead to a bigger probability of another climate disaster, or one tipping point may lead to another climate tipping point. But the same thing is true for transition risks. I remember my prime minister saying to me, look, if you can prove, Rick, that the Germans are doing it, then we will do it as well. And if the Germany is not doing it, go back to your office and be ashamed that you even tried to raise the green issue. This is a Labour Party. So it is clearly the case that I think if the most key players in the international policy-making network flip and they become green, then others will follow suit. So that you could call that cascading policy-making. Second question was to do with, I have to open my thing, it's a very short one, but so I have to, that was the heterogeneity of firms. I did not give an heterogeneous framework, but I think it is important because we have evidence that the largest firms are now the brownest firms, and the smaller firms are also where a lot of the R&D is going on, actually are the greener firms. So not to allow for large and big firms, for example, would not be allowing for heterogeneity between green and brown, both in what they are at the moment and what they might be in the future. So yes, an heterogeneous framework, I imagine there'll be more work on that in the future. Thank you.
Very quick reactions from panelists.
Okay, so let me start with reaction to Rick. So the point is that what do we mean by the term anticipation? So in what I meant, in the definition that I propose about transition risk is that firms know that there are potential different policies, the way firms know that there are different possible outcomes of the US elections. Now, what I simply say, they don't know what is the outcome. They know that there is a potential distribution. Now, how well they know the distribution, that's another story. That's what I mean by unanticipated. Don't know. So they they don't know exactly the outcome of the, so it's like a random variable. They know there's a random variable. They don't know the single material outcomes of the. Yeah, but then when you start saying, okay, do they know exactly the full distribution? Then, you know, we can have a discussion. Who knows the exact distribution of outcomes, even of the US elections? You know, nobody knows. Okay, but it's about how you interpret the verb. Anticipating, I mean,
Sounds like very interesting conversation.
Let me move on. Yeah.
For lunch. I think we were sitting together.
Just I wanted to say just one thing. The tool for SMEs versus investors. Actually, the tool is for investors because it allows to compute the alignment of a portfolio. It's not really. I mean, if you are an SMEs, you know what you're doing, and you can compute your own alignment. You don't need my tool. You need my tool in order to. If you are an investor and you have a lot of SMEs in your portfolios and you don't know exactly what they are doing. And I just want to conclude. AI, I think it's a very interesting development. At the same time, you know, garbage in, garbage out. It's just a probabilistic model that predicts outcomes. So if we have low quality data, you can, even if it's generative, you cannot generate high quality data from low quality data. Let's be clear on, you know, not to get illude ourselves.
Quickly reply to your question. No, we did not perform such evaluation yet because our data set does not contain a quantitative variable that indicates the amount of asset. We have qualitative variables, however, to indicate what the asset is, but this makes this kind of evaluation more involved. So we are currently thinking how to carry out this kind of evaluation, maybe recurring to machine learning, for instance.
Very quickly, I think that the killer change is that the accounting, the supervisory bodies recognize GHG protocol to provide impairments and provisions. And what is the response from the GHG protocol is the perfect thing. I think that we need a GHG protocol 2.0, super protocol 2050, that allow to the accountants, the accountancy profession, to introduce into the real provisions and impairments. And if this occur, it's magic. And the way that they choose how to translate it may be easy. What is the financial materiality of my company? My company has 80 million of financial materiality. That's fine. All the emissions that should have an impact on that should be reported with a different way. I think that is easy. I don't want to destroy the GHG protocol. I think that we need to evolve the GHG protocol to the second screen that fit for the next purpose. That could be material for the accountancy rules. Very quickly about the emerging markets. Don't forget the power of Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. We have the possibility to establish carbon markets with the emerging markets, and now we are shooting to the voluntary carbon markets, and probably we are shooting to the most powerful flow or impulse of funding to the emerging countries that we can have in our hands. It's a shadow carbon pricing at the end of the day. Don't push barriers to import their products. Help them in order to modernize their industrial network. Sorry, and the time, yes, it's very important for the lady who is now. Now, because the governing bodies of the GHG protocol is changing in the coming months. In the 1 year, we have only 1 year. If the new governing bodies change, they will have the opportunity to impulse this renovation or revisitation of the protocol. Thank you.